So you're ready to get to the top when it comes to grammar. So for getting a 5 on for editing your draft for our learning target 1.9, you will need to demonstrate that you can write in compound or complex sentences in your draft. So the first thing is understanding what the heck that means. So there I have this handy dandy sentence formation guide, which will be available to you, but it won't make much sense unless I talk you through it. So that's what this video is all about. So there's different ways to form, that's why this is a formation guide, compound and complex sentences. And I'm just going to go over the top 6 on this one. There's really more ways than this, plus there's a 7th one down here. And you can challenge yourself to write a compound complex sentence if you like. There is the guide there, and after I go over this information, you might be able to figure that out and do it for yourself. But I'm just going to focus on teaching you about these top ones here. Okay, so the first way to form a compound sentence, and by the way, if you notice at a glance, you can figure out what a compound sentence is if you sort of look at these 3, let's call them formulas, okay? So some of you who are maybe more math-minded than language-minded, and we need people like you in the world for sure, this might appeal to you because it's basically just a plug-and-play formula that you can use for writing sentences. Why would I challenge you to write these types of sentences? Well, if people always wrote in very simplistic sentences, nobody would ever want to read anything that anybody wrote because it would be very boring and dry and elementary sounding. So it's important that you write with variety, okay? So you wouldn't want every single sentence to be compound or complex or some combination of those. Some writers do write like that, and they're very wordy, and sometimes their sentences might lose you. We naturally kind of crave a break from that too. So we naturally crave that variety of bouncing back and forth between longer, more complex or compound sentences and simple sentences. And that's how we speak too. In fact, I just did it. So you can go ahead and rewind it and see what I'm talking about if you want. But compound sentences are basically 2 independent clauses that are stuck together with something in between. Now, I talked in a previous video about what a clause is. Remember, a clause is a group of words that contain a subject and a verb. An independent clause means that it can stand on its own. It could be its own sentence because it's also a complete thought on its own. Okay? Now, when we get down here, we'll talk about dependent clauses. Dependent clauses do contain a subject and a verb, but there's something about them that feels incomplete, so they rely on more words to be a part of a sentence. All of that sounds very abstract and confusing, so let's move on with examples because I think examples always make things clearer. So the first independent clause in this first type of compound sentence is the students prepared for the test. See how that's independent? First of all, it has a verb, prepared. Who prepared? The students, so the verb has a subject, and it's a complete thought. I could put a period at the end of this and it would make sense as its own sentence. The students prepared for the test, period. Okay? But we have this other independent clause that is related to the first one, and we want them to stay together in the same sentence. The second independent clause is they were still nervous about their performance. So our verb here is were nervous, okay? We have a helping verb, were. Just kidding. Were is your only verb here. It's a being verb. It's a state of being. They were. Can't we just be, man? So were is your verb. Who were? They were. There's your subject. And it makes sense on its own. They were still nervous about their performance. That could be its own sentence. But again, these are related to each other in meaning, and so we like to keep them together in the same sentence. Now, as demonstrated here, there are 3 different ways that you could connect 2 independent clauses that are related in meaning. The first way, you can drop a comma and then a coordinating conjunction. Now in a previous video, I showed you a ginormous list of conjunctions, and there's all different types. This is a specific kind called a coordinating conjunction. And I mentioned in that previous video, FANBOYS is an acronym that helps people remember what the coordinating conjunctions are. For, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. I wish these were in that order here. They're not, but they're all there. Those are your coordinating conjunctions. So one thing to remember, punctuation-wise, whenever we have a coordinating conjunction that's separating two independent clauses, we always have to put a comma there. Okay? Another thing to note, you cannot simply drop a comma between two independent clauses. That's actually something that we call a comma splice, where you try to use a comma where really a period should be, or where you need to add a coordinating conjunction. So just know that commas and coordinating conjunctions go hand in hand. They are a team when you are connecting two independent clauses. Okay, let's look at the second way that you can connect these independent clauses. The students prepared for the test. Semicolon. Many studied a few hours each day for 2 weeks. Ah, the elusive semicolon. So people can be very confused about how to use these properly. I've heard English teachers in the past say, just don't use them. Don't use semicolons to their students because they're so afraid that their students are going to mess up in using them. Which is sad because semicolons are maybe my favorite type of punctuation. They're super cool. And this is one way you can use them. Whenever you have two independent clauses that are related to each other, you want to keep them together in the same sentence. You can separate them with a semicolon. It's easy peasy. Lemon squeezy. All right, the third way to connect two independent clauses is to again use my friend the semicolon, and then to use a conjunctive adverb followed by a comma. Okay? Conjunctive adverb, Ms. Harrison, what the heck is that? That's a big grammar word. Sounds expensive. There's a nice list here for you. Oops, can't really highlight on this. Yes, I can. This right here is your list of conjunctive adverbs. It's a type of conjunction and it's a type of adverb. If you don't remember what an adverb is, adverbs describe verbs usually, sometimes adjectives or other adverbs. Okay, so basically these show a relationship between these clauses. So this is the most, not the most, because coordinated conjunctions do that too, but this is a very specific way of connecting these two clauses by showing the relationship between them. So our first clause is the students prepared for the test. Okay, the second one is they were still nervous about their performance. So we want to show a relationship between these. So even though they prepared, they were still nervous. So we have kind of a contradiction here. So whenever you're trying to write in this style of compound sentence, you want to be careful and selective about the conjunctive adverb that you pick because they all have different meanings. However fits nicely here. The students prepared for the test. However, they were still nervous about their performance. Okay? Because it wouldn't make sense if you said the students prepared for their test. As a result, they were still nervous. That doesn't make any sense at all. Because you would expect that if they prepared, they would not be nervous. You get my meaning? Okay. The thing to remember about number 3 is your punctuation is everything here. You need a semicolon before your conjunctive adverb and a comma after. And you want to make sure that you pick the conjunctive adverb that's right for the job. Don't just randomly pick one or you'll very much so confuse your reader. All right, complex sentences. Complex sentences are when you have an independent clause and a dependent clause connected in some way. Okay, what's a dependent clause? Well, we know independent clause is something that could stand on its own, which makes sense if you know what the word independent means. Okay, we celebrate Independence Day when America became its own country. Okay, when you become 18, you will move from being a dependent, where you rely on caretakers, to being independent, where technically you could move out on your own, and be by yourself. So think about that when you're trying to keep these straight. What is an independent clause versus a dependent clause? As I kind of mentioned earlier, dependent clause is dependent because, yes, it does contain a verb and its subject, but there is probably one or a couple words that make it not be able to stand on its own. So again, let's look at examples. And it tells you right here, the formula for a dependent clause is this. A dependent clause, you see this little arrow, it's a subordinating conjunction, and I'll talk about what that is in a second, added on to an independent clause. So if you took away the subordinating conjunction, it would be an independent clause itself. All right, the first independent clause we have is the students were nervous about their performance. Okay, were is the verb, students is subject, and it makes sense on its own. Okay, now look at the second half of the sentence, which is a different color here. Although they had prepared for the test. If I said that, if I just walked up to you and said, although they had prepared for the test, you would be so confused. You'd say, Ms. Harrison, did you have a stroke? That doesn't make sense. Because half of the sentence is missing, okay? This word although makes it dependent on some more information. Now watch if I took the word although out. I would say they had prepared for the test. Technically, that's a standalone sentence, okay? Now, you wouldn't know who they were without another sentence, but it's still independent. It can be in its own sentence because it is a complete thought, okay? Even if you don't know who they are. So when we put independent clause followed by a dependent clause, we have a complex sentence because complex sentences are some combination of those two things. Now, what is a subordinating conjunction? So glad you asked. There's a nice list right here of subordinating conjunctions. These also show some type of relationship, okay, between these independent clauses. Because, although, since, unless, until, when, after, as, if, while, as if, as a team, before, even if, once, so that, though, until, where. I'm pretty sure this probably is not an exhaustive list, but it's probably the most common ones that you'll see. And when you're building these types of sentences in your essay, definitely use this document as a formula sheet, a cheat sheet. I mean, until you get used to writing like this, you might need to look at something like this, and that's perfectly fine. The students were nervous about their performance, although they had prepared for the test. One thing to know about this sentence type number 4, complex sentences, when a dependent clause follows an independent clause, you don't need a comma in between them. You don't need any punctuation. One just flows straight into the other, okay? So if you were to put a comma before this dependent clause, that would be incorrect use of a comma, okay? All right, the fifth one just switches the order. You put the dependent clause first, and then, yes, you need a comma if you put that one first, and then follow it by an independent clause. Although they had prepared for the test, comma, the students were still nervous about their performance. Dependent clause, starting with a subordinating conjunction, although, comma, independent clause. All right, the last type is a little bit tricky. This is when you start an independent clause, you list the subject of it, then you interrupt that independent clause with a dependent clause, and then you put the rest of your independent clause that you started at the beginning of the sentence. Sounds confusing, so let's look at an example. The students who had prepared for the test were still nervous about their performance. So basically, the function of this little dependent clause here is to give you more information about the subject, okay? And it tells you how to build this specific type of dependent clause. It tells you it starts with one of these words, that, which, who, whom, plus your dependent clause. The students who had prepared for the test were still nervous about their performance. Notice that there is no punctuation required in the middle of this sentence. It flows off the tongue, and so we don't need any pauses or anything like that. And that's partially the function of a comma. So there's a little tutorial on how to build compound and complex sentences. If you need to reference the sheet, it will be attached to your editing checklist.